Helen Clark, thank you so much for joining us from Auckland. If I can jump straight into what's happened at the United Nations Security Council, we've got draft statements that were made by the ambassadors of the US and China. There were apparently two drafts, one proposed by Tunisia and the 10 non-permanent members, one by the P5. But would you say that the United Nations, instead of being at the bulwark, at the forefront of fighting this pandemic internationally, multilaterally, as it should be, is a more of like a global talking shop and they're missing in action?
Unfortunately, the Security Council has missed the opportunity to show leadership. Of course, it's never too late, but really, we're now more than 2 months into the World Health Organization declaring COVID-19 to be a public health emergency of international concern and not a constructive word from the Security Council. What a contrast that is with 2014, where President Obama asked Samantha Power, the permanent representative to the UN, to get a resolution through. And the Security Council came together to declare Ebola a global threat to peace and security. So I'm very, very disappointed. I think that countries have to keep the pressure up. The voice of a very large and powerful country like India matters a great deal on this. And I understand the Prime Minister Modi has been rallying the SAARC leaders, and his voice at G20 matters. But faced with this crisis for the world not to come together around what is far beyond now a serious health crisis, but a major economic crisis threatening the lives, livelihoods, status of poverty of people around the world, this is reprehensible.
You yourself have been part of a group of people who've written to the United Nations Security Council President. You've written to the G20 as well, warning of the dangers, asking people to step up to the plate, so as to speak. Is there any other forum if the United Nations Security Council is not doing it?
So the letter which former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown facilitated, and I supported him with outreach, we got an amazing response from former world leaders, dozens and dozens and dozens who said, count me in, because we all watch frustrated from our living rooms at the lack of action. In 2009, Prime Minister Gordon Brown was at the forefront of rallying the G20 leaders to address the global financial crisis, which could have sunk our peace and prosperity for years as well. And out of that came the $1 trillion package, which basically helped get things back on track. Now, Gordon Brown's letter, which very strongly support to G20 leaders, says, in effect, show this muscle again. Your economies have the combined weight to make a difference here. The letter recommends a task force of the G20, and it also has very specific asks, not only in the health sphere, which is so vital, but also for the economic recovery, because there's going to need to be an increase in access to special drawing rights from the IMF. There's going to need to be money for the World Bank and the regional development banks to help particularly the poorest countries who, if this pandemic sweeps through there, are going to be in very, very significant trouble. So I'm hopeful that as Gordon Brown and others continue to work behind the scenes, that it might be possible to get some action coming out of that G20 initiative rather sooner than from the UN Security Council. But what a tragedy that is, because the Security Council was set up to lead the world where there was a threat to peace and security, as there clearly is if our societies and economies come under incredible pressure from a pandemic.
So are you saying that since the United Nations Security Council is not really moving up to where it should be, if it's G20 that can do it, or are you maybe saying that there should be another international body or a forum or some leadership that comes together to take this fight forward?
My view is that Dr. David Nabarro, who has been a special advisor on a number of pandemics, because we've had a number this century, to former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, he's proposing a pandemic emergency coordination council. I agree with that. I think it should be a standing capacity. I think it should be headed by the UN Secretary General, the WHO Director General, the IMF and World Bank heads as well. And whenever there's a pandemic, that group should come together and then fan out among its many constituencies to get the action required. The WHO works with Health Minister. The Secretary General works with heads of government. Critically, probably above all, is that the IMF and World Bank constituency is finance ministers, and effective responses do require money to be invested. So I think a standing capacity is a lesson we should learn out of that. But actually, we need that council now. We need those four actively convened and supported by G20 leaders, supported by the Security Council and General Assembly to do their job. I am concerned that the WHO has pretty much been left on its own and with insufficient support to do what it knows has to be done.
Ms. Clark, again, you were referring earlier to Prime Minister Modi's efforts both in the region, which is SAARC, and then his prominent place in G20, even though it was convened by the Saudis. Those kind of measures, do you see them isolated? How does it all come together in terms of a global fight?
There's so many levels of action, and the regional level is very important. You know, imagine if we had the SAARC region leading as a model for the world on how a region could organize itself. Sadly, we're watching the European Union, which can't reach unity itself on the approach. And some of its countries are in such terrible distress. Look at Italy, look at Spain, France, very bad epidemic. Germany's being managed as well as could be the case from what one could see. But the European-wide coordination isn't there. So SAARC could be a model of what a group of countries in a region could achieve. So I think that initiative is very important.
When you talk about what's happening vis-a-vis international politics, now we've seen how the US has been calling it the Wuhan virus, the China virus. There are many other countries or people who are also doing that. In terms of not the Chinese people, it's clearly not a racist position. It's about the Chinese state not giving out data, not being transparent, and not helping the world deal with it before it really had to deal with it. Whereas the Chinese say that we're now helping 84 to 100 countries around the world. In that polarization, what's really your stand?
I have a perspective on this, and firstly it is that a blame game has no constructive purpose at all. We need to come together as a world to fight the virus. My second point comes from my experience as a head of government in interacting with China in the past. And my experience has been that once Beijing recognizes that there is a problem, you do get action. Now, in this case, I think there was some reluctance at the provincial level to fess up. When Beijing got a focus on this, it moved, and it moved very, very decisively to limit the spread of the disease. Now, what I also think is incredibly unfair are the attacks on the WHO. Look, there will be lessons learned out of this, but the WHO, as soon as it was notified, made efforts to get to China. It acts on the advice of an advisory body set up under its rules. As soon as they recommended that the global public health emergency be declared, the WHO declared it. And it was warning of the possibility of this spinning out of control as a pandemic for weeks before it finally used the word pandemic to jolt people into action. When we look back at the slow train wreck that has happened over the last 2 months, all the signs were there from the end of January that every country needed to dust off its pandemic preparedness plan and work out what it was going to do. And the reality is that most sat and watched what was happening in China and thought, how terrible, and until it hit them. So many lessons to be learned, but please don't anyone blame the WHO, which was crying fire long before most realised the fire was going to burn them.
Helen Clark, when we look at different countries and how they have really tackled the issue or tackling the issue, look at China apart. When you look at Southeast Asia or East Asia, whether it's different political leanings or dispensations within those countries, whether it's South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, you go to Europe, you have a Swedish model, which seems to be slightly different from the others in terms of not a complete lockdown, but only trying to isolate people who are vulnerable, the elderly, those who have diseases, and hoping that possibly the young will, through mingling, get some kind of herd immunity. And then you have New Zealand yourself, your country, which had a strict lockdown. Yes, admittedly, your population is maybe only 5 million. But how do you view these various ways that different countries have been tackling it?
So I think New Zealand is following a classic public health approach. It's obviously informed by what has happened with the significant progress in East Asia and Southeast Asia, in some places in knocking back the pandemic. So we do have a complete lockdown. Our aim is elimination. And frankly, it would not be tenable in New Zealand to take the approach that Sweden has taken. You know, just today we've recorded the second death from the virus, and it's from tragically a person in their 90s, and COVID-19 somehow got into their rest home. And I think our hearts go out to every family with their older members in these retirement facilities who are so vulnerable if someone walks in with COVID-19. So our aim is elimination. We now quarantine every arrival at the airport for 14 days. Only New Zealanders and permanent residents can return to New Zealand at this point. We are doing everything we can. I think China threw everything at it. Singapore does. Korea does. There are some amazing efforts. But I still hear of people flying into Heathrow who aren't asked any questions whatsoever.
Just again, focusing on what you were talking about, New Zealand, they seem to be the only country led by the Prime Minister who are looking at eliminating the pandemic. Everyone else is looking at containing it or riding it out. The flip side is, experts would say, the population is very small in comparison to other countries, and it's probably widespread, maybe not densely populated. What are your thoughts on that, Ms. Clark?
So we have a real chance of elimination and holding out against the virus until a vaccine becomes available. That is not short term. We're going to take very significant economic damage from this, but so is every country, whether or not they've got a good or a bad public health response. What we do know is that if you bungle the public health response, the economic damage will be more protracted and more deep. So it's the devil in the deep blue sea. And we have opted for an approach here, which I totally support, of going for elimination and not having our elderly and vulnerable exposed to something which kills. Of course, we also read the tragic stories from around the world of the babies who've died, of the teens who've died, of the fit and active people in their prime of their lives who have died. So it is a very disturbing virus. It's one that we do not yet know anything like enough about. For example, how long would you be immune to it if you've had it? The jury is out on all these questions. And when the jury's out, my operating principle always is take a precautionary approach.
Helen Clark, we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much, ma'am, and do stay safe.
Thank you so much.